Okay, welcome everyone. I see our participants, audience members filtering in, and it is really great to have all of you for what will be a very important webinar today, and really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us, and in particular our speakers, who I will be introducing in just a moment, but I should probably start by introducing myself. Deborah Shushan. I'm the Director of Policy at J Street. And of course, we are here to talk about the dire need to address the catastrophic situation on the ground in Gaza. And this is something I should note, that J Street has been extremely concerned with the humanitarian situation on the ground in Gaza since the very beginning of this conflict, after the horrific attack by Hamas on October 7th inside Israel. We have been extremely concerned about the humanitarian impact on civilians in Gaza. And of course, we have been advocating strongly for humanitarian aid and for the ability of that aid to actually get to civilians in Gaza who need it. And so I did want to just mention to folks that the J Street Policy Center, which is hosting this webinar, produced an issue brief on this subject just last week, which has a number of concrete recommendations for how humanitarian aid can be surged into Gaza, as well as an analysis of what the specific issues are that are holding up that aid. And I see that my colleague has put that into the chat, so thank you so much for that. I also just want to note that a recording of this discussion will be available later today on J Street's YouTube channel for you to rewatch and share. And so I do encourage you to check back at our YouTube channel later in the day. And I know my colleague's going to drop that link, and there it is in the chat as well. I have such good backup here. It's phenomenal. So we have a two-part webinar for you all today. And we are so privileged and honored to have with us for the first part of the webinar, Senator Peter Welch, who I'm sure is well known to all of you. We're going to plunge in with some comments from Senator Welch, who's going to give us an update on where humanitarian aid and the appropriation of that aid in a supplemental bill, where all of that stands right now. So he's going to talk about that. And I just want to introduce him, even though I'm sure that folks do know him. He, of course, is the U.S. Senator from Vermont, the junior senator. You can tell from his spry-looking appearance, Vermont's junior senator. But of course, he did serve previously for several years as Vermont's sole member in the House of Representatives, representing Vermont's at-large congressional district, and that was from 2007 to 2023. And I should note, of course, that during that time, after the establishment of J Street, he became a tremendous champion for J Street, and we are so happy to be able to work with him now in the U.S. Senate. And I just want to mention that Senator Welch last week was one of 25 senators to sign a letter urging President Biden to urgently take 5 specific steps to increase the flow of humanitarian aid to Gaza. So, Senator Welch, we are so grateful that you're joining us today and grateful for your leadership on this issue. And I'm going to turn it over to you for some remarks.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted, as always, to be with J Street. And, let me start by just expressing my gratitude to J Street. Never has your work been more important than right now. I mean, October 7, the trauma that lives on, obviously. And a J Street trip, I was down in Sderot, which, of course, was one of the places that was attacked. And it's very sad to me that so many Israelis lost their lives. And of course, being in southern Israel, it was many of the folks who were very much J Street aligned in their commitment to a two-state solution, and had good relations with folks living in Gaza. So it's just heartbreaking to me that so many innocent people were so savagely killed. And so I want to express that. What's happening now in the aftermath with the incredible devastation in Gaza is just catastrophic. The initial bombing campaign with the use of 2,000-pound bombs, and basically a situation where Hamas, in fact, does use humans as Palestinians as human shields, doesn't give license to a war plan that and ends up killing so many civilians. But you'll be talking with people who have more information at the moment about the devastation in Gaza, but we know what it is. I mean, 27,000 people have been killed. Probably 2/3 of those are women and children. 2 million people have been displaced. And it doesn't take much imagination to think how bad it is for folks who have had to move and be uprooted, taking with them whatever they could carry or put on the flatbed of a truck with a couple of other families. And then to relocate down in Khan Yunis and then be told, a week or two later that they have to go from there to some other place, all the while that the military campaign is continuing. So you all know that there's just devastating shortages of water, of food, of medicine, and think about it. Since October 7, there's many Palestinian families that have lost loved ones as well, but who have not had a home. And the situation that is being described right now is that there's a very significant chance that more people will lose their lives from hunger and disease than from the bombing. So, and of course, we have on this call, well, you, Deborah, thanks you for all your work, but who's been working in this forever is going to be able to speak about this, but I just want to make a special acknowledgement of Ahmed, who's here and has lost so many members of his own family back in Gaza. So we can't lose sight of that, no matter how much it is that we acknowledge that the attack by Hamas was brutal, was violent, and the reaction and the right of Israel to defend itself, we acknowledge. But the manner in which it's done, where there's so many innocent Palestinians, and there's so much ongoing humanitarian suffering, is not acceptable. And where we are in Congress is, I think, a universal sense of horror at what happened on October 7th to innocent Israelis. There is a broad support for Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas. I think there is a growing apprehension and horror at the incredible humanitarian catastrophe that is ongoing and getting worse. We have legislation that we're going to vote today on, and it's that package of that includes the border deal, it includes Ukraine funding, and it includes money for Israel. The Israeli, in that package, as you know, the Republicans now don't want to do the border deal, so that's probably not going to go through. And I think what will happen is that proceeding on that three-tiered package will be defeated, and we'll come back with a package that will include Ukraine and Israel. There are a number of us who've been making a strong case to Senator Schumer, and I think Senator Van Hollen and Senator Merkley have been leaders. And as you know, they went over to the border with Egypt and Gaza to document the dilemmas, the delays and logistical hassles of getting food and medicine in. But a number of us are pushing hard on getting humanitarian aid in. And in this overall package, there's $10 billion for humanitarian aid. But let me be candid, it's humanitarian aid that would be not specifically to Gaza. It would include the ability for it to go to Gaza. but it would also include would help in Ukraine and in other locations. So I don't have a lot of confidence that the amount of money that is in there comes anywhere near meeting the need. But secondly, the reality, and this is a real dilemma, as long as there's active conflict in that tiny geographic area, Gaza, how are you delivering the aid? And we know right now that over 500,000 people are starving. People can't get access to medicine. The sanitation situation is gone from deteriorating to being non-existent. So, the bottom line here is that until the conflict stops, we're not going to be able to really get the aid in. And that is, I think, an even more direct statement about the need for Israeli cooperation than having them cooperate with the aid organizations at getting more trucks in and getting more efficient inspections. And some of the practical things that need to be done in order to get the aid from outside to where it's needed. And of course, there's been hundreds of aid workers whose lives have been lost, and they've been victims of the military campaign. So my candid view is that until the fighting stops, we can't realistically think of a way in which the aid that's needed can be delivered. And that's why many of us, and I think the president is really, really pushing for Israel to do everything, including ultimately a ceasefire to get the hostages back and hopefully get the aid in. But we're in a very, very perilous position until and unless the fighting ends, really, because whatever aid we can authorize, and I think there'd be a big appetite in Congress to get the aid in, we're not going to be able to deliver it when the aid workers trying to deliver it are going to be on the receiving end of some of the military conflict that still is raging in Gaza. The specifics of what's going to happen on the bill, pardon me, are unknown at this point, but I expect by the end of the weekend, we'll probably have a positive vote on Ukraine and Israel. Some folks have a concern about Israel. I put myself among them. I'm totally for defensive aid, for the Iron Dome and David Sling. I'm for humanitarian aid. I don't want the U.S. to be providing money for offensive weapons and the 2,000-pound bombs and the artillery shells. I think that's the wrong thing for us to be doing. And, I really have a sadness about two things. Number one, just that the situation for the Palestinians is so grim, and the absolute urgency of getting to a two-state solution is so compromised, obviously, by this. And the second lament is that, I think Israel's never been in a stronger position in the Middle East. In the early days, in decades past, the existential threat Israel faced was from nation states that surrounded it. They attacked it, and they wanted to get rid of Israel as a state. Israel has pretty good relations with its Arab neighbors these days, and was on the cusp of normalization with Saudi Arabia. In fact, I think a lot of the Arab states admire the Israeli state and Israelis and what they've accomplished. And obviously the threat to Israel is much more internal with the conflict that continues on the West Bank, and the violence there is escalating. And of course, with what's happening in Gaza and with Hamas. And the internal dynamics of the politics in Israel are something that has got to be dealt with if Israel's going to go to what I know J Street is a big advocate of, and I am as well, the two-state solution. But the Israel we have now has very secure relations with Arab states. That is threatened as much by the loss of Palestinian life as anything, because it's creating an immense amount of concern among the Arab street. And those good relations that Israel has had with its neighboring states are compromised by what's going on in Gaza. And the Israel of Ben-Gvir and the Israel of the Netanyahu government with the right-wing coalition, I think, is a detriment, obviously, to the two-state solution. So the immediate situation in Congress is focused on this aid package. I expect it'll be passed, with some of us expressing our opposition to the military component of it, but very robustly supportive of humanitarian aid, and also very, very continuing to be engaged with the advocacy for a two-state solution, which is so profoundly important. And you're seeing, of course, the administration, through the president and his words and the efforts of Secretary Blinken, trying to put that front and center on the agenda. But very, very tough domestically for Israel to be in a place, given what's happened on October 7th, to really engage there. And to some extent, the Palestinians as well, who obviously are feeling just an enormous amount of suffering as a result of the ongoing war. So that's a quick summary of where we are. But I want to end where I began, and that is to thank J Street for its steadfast advocacy in what is a very, very incredibly difficult time with the trauma of October 7th. We in this country reacted to 9/11 with the trauma that goes with it. And it's a searing reality that violence as a tactic, which Hamas used, unfortunately, is a very effective tactic in disrupting a country, because we all need and have to have security. But it's really sad to me, the suffering that is ongoing in Gaza. And it's very disappointing to me, the setback that we've been making towards trying to deal with democratic institutions in Israel and a two-state solution that we know ultimately has to be the way in which there'll be durable peace in the Middle East. So thank you very much for allowing me to be with you, and thank you very much for all the work you're going to be continuing to do.
Thank you so much for that, Senator. Before you have to run, and I know we can't keep you for too long because you have a lot of work that you need to do over there in the Senate, could I just ask you a couple of quick follow-up questions? Would that
Sure.
be all right? Super. Could you just dig in for us a little bit into what is in the Senate supplemental? We know that the broader package that includes the border deal, as you indicated, that's likely not going to survive a cloture vote. But if you could still lay out for us what's on tap in terms of the Israel aid component, humanitarian aid that would benefit civilians in Gaza. I know our folks are particularly interested in hearing a little bit about the situation vis-a-vis UNRWA and where that stands in terms of congressional legislation. And if I can just throw in another piece to that, Senator, I know that you've been very supportive of amendments that J Street also supports. For example, those led by Senator Van Hollen, Senator Kaine, to ensure that there are guardrails in terms of any security assistance to Israel, to ensure that there is congressional oversight. So if you could give us a sense of what is likely to happen with those efforts, it would be really helpful.
The debate about the Israel funding is different than it's been in the past. It's always been a standard procedure that it was totally unrestricted, no conditions whatsoever. That's not the case now. So the package includes $17 billion that would go to Israel in change. And a portion of that would be for military assistance. A portion of it would be for what's classically been defensive positions, the David Sling and in the Iron Dome, and broad support for that, because the fewer Israelis that are in jeopardy or who are injured or killed, the better. So strong support that there. Humanitarian aid as well. But again, my caveat on the humanitarian aid is it's not effectively going to be delivered if as long as the conflict is very, very much active. But then there is a provision that got put in to make certain that none of the humanitarian aid went through UNRWA because of what happened with those 12 UNRWA workers who were affiliated with Hamas. And ironically, well, two things. One, if the UNRWA is the only organization that has the capacity to deliver the aid, it's got about 30,000 employees. So there's evidence here that 12 were doing things that are totally illegal and should be prosecuted. But should we stop allowing UNRWA in continuing to do the work that only it can do? And I totally am opposed to doing that, because the effect of that is really to compromise the ability to deliver the aid. Also, and I'm very relieved about this, the Israeli government has made it very clear that they want UNRWA to stay involved, because they have three options. You know, UNRWA continues to provide the aid. Two, Israel has to take on the burden of delivering aid to the civilian population. Or three, Israel allows the civilian population to starve. So I'm very pleased that the Netanyahu government has said it's their position that UNRWA should continue to be able to do its work. So that's a matter of real concern to us on a very practical level. On the question of conditions, Senator Van Hollen has been our leader here, and he's put together some conditions that basically say this aid has to be distributed in accordance and used in accordance with American law. And that has never been done before. But why that's controversial, I don't know. But it also requires a reporting on how the funds are used. And we do that all the time. And for instance, with Ukrainian aid. So these are standard procedures that apply to any aid that we give anywhere else, but they become controversial around Israel. And it mystifies me a little bit that just the basic rules of accountability should not be applied to every recipient of aid. So those, I think, we may get a vote on. This is all within the ultimate authority of Mr. Schumer, who's very strongly in favor of humanitarian aid. But he's got to do the calculations as to what this does to the overall package. But you've got Chris with his amendments that many of us support, your J Street friends. Tim Kaine has always been a leader on making certain that if arms are transferred by the administration, that they report that to Congress so that we have an opportunity to weigh in. That applies to any kind of military transfer, but Israel has been not subject to what is applicable to everyone else. So that's another amendment he'll be offering and I'll be supporting. So that's what's different in this case. There's a recognition that the kind of business as usual or special exemption for normal accountability standards should not continue.
Thanks so much for that, Senator. I really just have one more question for you, and then we'll let you go, but more of a step back basic question. You mentioned in your remarks, and I am absolutely sure that this is true, that every member of the United States Congress was extremely concerned about what happened on October 7th and the horrific attack by Hamas and other militants in Israel, and wants to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And of course, J Street is 110% on that page as well, as I know you are. I am interested to know your sense, if you have a sense, talking to colleagues across the aisle, how widespread a concern for civilians in Gaza and what they're enduring is, and whether it's something that is not only on the Democratic side, is it Do you see that in your Republican colleagues? I hate to make it a partisan issue, but I'm very interested in this, and I think maybe our viewers might be as well.
I mean, I think two things. Number one, it's regrettable that since I've been in Congress, I came to I was in the House for 16 years, and now I'm my second year in the Senate. There was much more bipartisan support for Israel, and that it's become more of a partisan issue. And to some extent, that really got accelerated during the time when President Obama was promoting the Iran nuclear deal, which J Street supported and I strongly supported. You had the Republican speaker inviting then Prime Minister Netanyahu basically to come to Congress in the House of Congress and advocate against what was a major presidential effort, and that was the Iran nuclear deal. And then in the last administration, a lot of that partisanship really accelerated. And I think the domestic politics in Israel changed, obviously, with this recent administration. So the question on the humanitarian aid and the concern, I think everybody, it doesn't matter what your party is or what your orientation is. You see some of these scenes of children getting pulled out of buildings. You see families, with carts or walking or with a totally overloaded flatbed truck. It's heartbreaking. But there is, I'd say, some members who have a point of view that whatever Israel has to do to destroy Hamas, it can do. And it's none of our business to get in their way or ask questions. And therefore, they are more willing to accept the inevitability of massive losses of civilian lives. There's others of us who don't share that view, that the fact that Hamas does use people as human shields does not give Israel license to essentially have a war plan that's going to kill a lot of people, as opposed to have an immense amount of restraint, which is difficult. But also who have, my view is that the more Palestinian lives that are lost, the more difficult it becomes for us ultimately to get to a peaceful resolution and a two-state solution. So I think the more this war goes on, and the more Palestinian lives are lost, the more difficult it's going to be for ultimately Israel to get that security that it's entitled to. And that's a different point of view. And then, of course, there's some of my colleagues who essentially see the Palestinians as all pro-Hamas, and it's their people, and it's the price they got to pay. I reject that. Just about a month before October 7th, there was a massive demonstration in Gaza City from Palestinians opposing just the oppressive rule of Hamas. And then to some extent, the question of the Palestinians, this is what's so heartbreaking for me, when we've got Ahmed here, who just knows, not just as a Palestinian, but as a Palestinian who has family members who he's lost, that reality of the human condition gets abstracted. And that's a heartbreak for me, because this is really about lives that matter.
Senator, we are so grateful for you. You know that J Street could not do the work that it does if it weren't for our champions like yourself. And we really appreciate you taking the time with us today. And Godspeed in your important work.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and have a good conference. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Senator. All right, folks. We're going to move on to part 2 of our webinar today, after that conversation with Senator Welch. And so I'm going to introduce our 2 speakers in just a second. I'm also just going to note for folks that, as usual, you have the opportunity to put in questions for our speakers, and you can do that at the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I also just want to note that Ahmed is going to have to leave us at the top of the hour at 1 p.m. Eastern. And so we're going to try
That changed. I'm so sorry. That changed. I'm here through the end.
All right, alhamdulillah, we are good with Ahmed till 1:15, and we have Tania until then as well, so that's phenomenal. Okay, so let me introduce our two speakers in that case. You just heard the voice of Ahmed Alkhatib. He is a Palestinian-American humanitarian activist, originally from Gaza. He is the founder and executive director of Project Unified Assistance, which is a nonprofit organization that has been working toward the establishment of a humanitarian airport in Gaza. And he also, as many of you will know, has been writing quite extensively since this war began 4 months ago, and in fact has a brand new piece out in the Atlantic today. And I'm sure one of my colleagues is going to drop a link to that in the chat. And so we look forward to hearing from Ahmed. I also want to welcome our colleague, Tania Hary from Gisha. I'm sure many of you already know Tania. She is the executive director of Gisha, an extremely important Israeli NGO that was founded in 2005 with the goal of protecting the freedom of movement of Palestinians in Gaza in accordance with international and Israeli law. And so we are really privileged to have these two speakers with us today. Welcome and thank you to Ahmed and Tania. All right, folks, we have some questions here. We're going to get right underway with our two speakers. And Ahmed, I would like to start with you. Senator Welch noted that you have your family, many of your family members are in Gaza, and tragically, you have lost tens of family members, something that you have written about. And so I would like to start with you. You also have family members in Gaza who are still alive and trying to survive this war. Can you give us a sense from what you are hearing from your family, friends, and other contacts of what the situation is like on the ground in Gaza today?
Well, thanks again, Deborah, for the invitation, the opportunity to speak here. So yes, unfortunately, every day is a struggle. Every hour is a struggle. I have various bits and pieces of information that flow in daily about what is happening in the north, in Khan Yunis, and in the south, in Rafah, where most of Gaza's population has been inhumanely squeezed. So I have my brother in there. He works for an international NGO that is delivering medical aid. So he has also kind of helped me understand the humanitarian landscape, if you will. But starting in the north, where our family is from Gaza City, from the center of Gaza City, and our family home was destroyed in October, late October, in an airstrike. It's very common for a lot of folks in Gaza to live in family buildings. So I grew up in a house with a 4-story home where each uncle had their own stories, their own floor. And then as time goes on, their entire family gets married and has an extensive family in there. So that's why when one of these homes is struck, you end up with dozens of people losing their lives. So my uncle, Ibrahim, my dad's brother, he is currently sheltering in the remains of our destroyed home with my cousin, Mo'min, who's severely physically and mentally disabled, such that when their family fled to Khan Yunis and Rafah, my uncle, who was severely injured, and my cousin, who is disabled, they were too burdensome to move. So they have been now for 4 months sheltering at the bottom of the remains of our family home. As for the rest of the family, they kept, including my brother, they kept going down south to southern parts of Gaza City, and then to Nusayrat and Maghazi, and then to Deir el-Balah, and then to Khan Yunis. My brother fled 7 different times. Each one of these times, the place where they were at ended up being hit, and so they had to keep moving southwards. As we speak right now, my Aunt Tahani and Isra, the wife of Uncle Ibrahim, have been surrounded for 2 weeks at the Amma Hospital, which is in the center of Khan Yunis. So that's an area that's seeing heavy ground operations, and it's near the Nasser Hospital. As we speak, my brother and dozens of his colleagues from this humanitarian NGO that they work for, British NGO. They are sheltering on the floor of an abandoned coffee shop. And they are lucky in that they at least are within the humanitarian community. They can access some food, but every day they have to spend at least an hour and a half trying to find water from various wells that have been heavily polluted and depleted. They have to operate under very dangerous conditions because the operations now are expanding southwards. We have utter devastation throughout the Gaza Strip, such that even just basic movement of people, cargo, goods is difficult because of the destruction to the roads and the infrastructure. We have people desperately piling up at the aid distribution center, tens of thousands, where you end up with these apocalyptic scenes of folks having a stampede, trying to access whatever aid is there. People in the north, which the northern Gaza Strip has been completely isolated, and very little, if any, aid makes it up there. They're in between Hamas returning to some areas vacated by the IDF. Then you have like 1 or 2 trucks that make it in there, and people are absolutely going crazy trying to access this food. And again, nothing really makes a dent in their needs. So, and then of course, the elephant in the room is the massive bombardment, largely concentrated in the south, that makes it difficult for people to move, further erodes what remains of the infrastructure, such that people can't use cars because any moving target, any moving car is a potential target for the IDF. And so layers upon layers of suffering due to the bombardment, due to the Hamas police and the criminal enterprise that have spread throughout the Gaza Strip, which, if you walking down the street with a bag of flour or bag of food, like you're a target for a lot of criminals or desperate people to be robbed of that aid. You have the unfortunate scenario of a lot of people want to get out of Gaza. Either they have family elsewhere that can host them, but the Egyptian border is not only shut due to political decision, but it's also, there's a lot of corruption and bribery that has to take place, where sometimes, a single person trying to get out of Gaza has to pay upwards of $7,000 to $9,000 a pop for being able to get out. So imagine if you have a family of 5 or 10 trying to leave, and the tens of thousands of dollars that Gaza, the financial system has all but collapsed. So there's no foreign remittances. There's very little access to the ATMs or to any banks. That there are no operating banks. So even if you have money in the bank, how do you actually access food that is on the market? Which, by the way, there are, Kogat, the good people at Kogat in the IDF keep sharing these images to try to counter this idea that there's starvation, by showing, oh, look, there's a tomato stand. Oh, look, there's a market operating here. Well, no one said there's like nothing in Gaza. The problem is most people can't afford what little goods and supplies are in there remain. So layers upon layers of horror, of suffering, of being cold. My little nieces and nephews, my brother's children that I have used to talk to every day on WhatsApp before the war, and I see their shrinking faces. I see the blackness around their eyes. They're not sleeping. I see the fear. I see the horror. I see the uncertainty. Baby Ahmed, who is a year old, Maria, who's 2, Fuad and Tala, who are 11 and 12. I mean, to me, this is not a spectator sport. Like, I see them. And if my brother, who has access to humanitarian supplies, he has access to some humanitarian supplies, he's not rolling in the dough, they're facing, dwindling supplies. You can imagine just the average person and how horrendous the circumstances are. And I'll conclude with this. I have been pushing, part of my pushing for, and we can talk about it in detail later, the airdrops, is specifically because it's not enough to just get aid into Gaza. I mean, the aid theft is a problem, not just by Hamas, but by organized criminals. But just the distribution and the capacity issues and the infrastructure issues, and obviously the combat operations, the centralized distribution model has failed so many Gazans, such that it's not enough to talk about the aid. Needs to be detailed discussions, including creative ideas for how that aid is distributed.
Thank you so much for that, Ahmed. Tania, I'd like to turn to you to to start the discussion about Israeli policy. Prime Minister Netanyahu has stated that Israel is only allowing, quote, the minimum amount of aid into Gaza. Why is that? And how and why is Israel preventing the entry of sufficient aid into Gaza?
So thanks so much. I want to echo the thanks to J Street for inviting me, and it's great to be on this panel with the senator and also with Ahmed and with you, Deborah. So, I was contemplating the answer to this question, and I don't remember. I've been out of the US for a long time. I don't know if we have this expression in English that you say somebody is speaking out of both sides of their mouth. The idea is that, on the one hand, the Israeli government spokespeople, Netanyahu, Kogat, they're saying to the international community, we're allowing everything in, we're allowing enough in, there's no hunger. They're saying that also to the ICJ, of course. And then in Israel, especially, they're saying, we're preventing, we're allowing only the minimum, and we're applying pressure. And I think that, the fact is that not enough is getting in, that's where we have to put our efforts is really in the fact of the situation. Need is so massive, as Ahmed already, indicated. The situation on the ground is so dangerous, really, that the only way that we can even begin to address this catastrophe is through a ceasefire. So I think that's where we need to put our efforts, trying to understand what the logic is in the intention. Will, I think, complicate things at the moment. And I think that what we're seeing on the ground is the reality. People don't have enough. What's coming in is not enough to meet need. And, there are a number of limiting factors to more aid coming in. Maybe I'll start with things that are really just a matter of policy. So after October 7th, Israel basically said, we're shutting down access via Israel, even though most of what had been coming in before had been from Israel. So access via Israeli ports, sourcing of goods in Israel and in the West Bank. The international community was actually only bringing in goods through Israel, not through Egypt. So just in making the decision that no goods would be coming in via Israel or via the West Bank already created basically a logistical nightmare, where you had the international community overnight having to figure out how to suddenly move massive amounts of aid through Egypt. In the first few weeks, of course, nothing was allowed in. But after that, on October 21st, when Israel did lift the total siege on Gaza, you had a kind of scramble by the international community to try to figure out how to bring things in. And that situation has basically stayed the same. 4 months in, we're still dealing with a lot of logistical issues. And as a matter of policy, Israel is still not allowing goods to come in through Israeli ports or be sourced inside of Israel or in the West Bank, other than a small amount of flour, which it agreed to allow in for the UN as a special gesture to Secretary of State Blinken after he asked for it. So that's something that we're calling, to be allowed immediately. Of course, in addition to the actual truckloads of aid that are needed, electricity is still being blocked. So there is literally no electricity in the grid inside of Gaza, and then limitations on fuel going in, which is needed for backup generators. So that's also, of course, affecting the entire humanitarian operation and people's ability to have access to water. It's affecting the sanitation situation. Another main issue is the fact that Israel is just physically controlling the crossing points. So right now you do have Rafah that is operating, and Kerem Shalom on the Israeli border, but Israel is checking the aid that's coming in through both of those crossings, and it's limiting what can come in, basically to food, water, and medicine, and also some shelter items. And there's a long list of items that are blocked from coming in, items that Israel says are dual use, but are desperately needed for the humanitarian response. I actually got a copy of the list. I printed it out. I have it in front of me. It's a list that was compiled by the international community. Israel actually hasn't told anyone what's not allowed in. So the internationals are, from experience, basically gathering examples of items that are mostly blocked from coming in. The list includes things like batteries, solar panels or anything with solar panels, flashlights, medical equipment, all kinds of medical devices, water hoses, cables, stretchers. You know, a lot of these items, I can't figure out at all why they might be being blocked. And at the end of the day, the result is that the humanitarian response is very, very partial. It's just really not meeting needs on the ground. And you know, the main issue that you know, has already been discussed, I think, at length, again, is what I started with about ceasefire. The issue of distribution within the Strip is a huge one. It's not safe anywhere in Gaza. And also access to the north is still being blocked. So that's where you have really, really massive need, situations likely already of famine. There's not even enough information and access to people to assess the situation there. And it's just really a massive catastrophe, this issue of not being able to safely access people in need wherever they are throughout the Strip. So that's just a few of the things that we're looking at.
Thank you for that, Tania. We have a question, I think, that from one of our audience members that I think follows on to what you just shared with us, Tania. And the question is about Israeli public opinion about the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and whether that is something that Israelis are sufficiently aware of. Do they care about it? Can you share that with us?
So look, maybe I'll start with some bad news, and then I'll try to give some good news at the end of that. You know, I really related to what the senator was describing about his colleagues in the Senate or in Congress. You know, I think that people's hearts are very much hardened to the situation in Gaza, and some of those people, you know, maybe they couldn't be made to care no matter what, you know, no matter what. But I do think that there is a large center in the middle of people who think, like what the senator described, that, you know, there's no other choice, that it's either our safety and security, or it's the safety and security of people in Gaza, of Palestinians. People who think that Israel also has no responsibility, that all of what we're seeing in Gaza is a result of Hamas's choices on October 7th, or their continued holding of hostages, the fact that their positions on an agreement are hard, and they don't assign any responsibility to the choices that Israel has made since October 7th, in the way it's conducting its hostilities, in the way it's, you know, laying siege to Gaza. So I think that I do want to give credit to people, of course, that there is a lot of fear, there's a lot of trauma. There's also, I would add, a complete media blackout here. There are no human stories in the Israeli media other than in Haaretz. But, you know, you have to go and seek them out. And I know that's hard for people to understand because their feeds are full of information. But I really think that people here in Israel can go a long time without seeing what's happening on the other side. But like I said, even if they do know, there are a lot of people who think it's, you know, it might be sad, but it's not our problem. And that is really hard. And it's something that Gisha is working on trying to overcome where we can. I promised a bit of good news, and I will say that Gisha in the last days has managed to organize a call for ceasefire. And I'll say that, you know, we were among the first organizations calling for ceasefire. And a lot of people, of course, didn't understand that position and certainly didn't adopt it. And as time has gone on, we've checked in with our community and said, how about now? How about now? And we had kind of slowly growing coalition. And we decided, you know what, no matter how many organizations join, we're going to come out now with this call and bring on as many colleagues as we can. And I have been really floored by the response. We're at over 30 organizations now who have signed on, and I've been offline for the last hour, so it might even be more than that now. And there are a number of organizations that you wouldn't have expected to join us. And it really takes courage, I have to say, in Israeli society to take this position, again, because the call for ceasefire is being framed as if we're sacrificing our own security, or we're sacrificing the lives of Israeli hostages. And that's certainly not what it means at all. So that's my bit of good news. And of course, we're a small minority of people right now, but I do hope that this call for ceasefire can show more and more people that there is another way to think about these things.
Deborah, may I just add like a super quick add-on to just what Tania said? I spoke to someone over the weekend who is involved with the IDF and a lot of like the PR arm, as well as the humanitarian side of things. And I was proposing all these different ideas for like how the IDF can publicly and like assertively take certain positions, make certain proposals or creative ideas for how they can address some of the humanitarian issues in Gaza. And she just said to me, like flat out, like very openly, and I'm not violating her trust, I'm not revealing anything that's private. She was like, on the one hand, a lot of the people there are a lot of level heads in the IDF on the humanitarian side who know that Israel must absolutely deal with the crisis, not just out of the goodness of their heart, but because this will harm Israel politically, legally, tactically, strategically, and otherwise. She was like, on the other hand, there's no way in which like these guys don't want to be seen as publicly promoting something that will help Gazans because of the PR considerations in Israel. These guys are optimizing for the Israeli general public, which generally speaking, we're not general, I mean, oxymoron, I'm generalizing, but generally speaking, is apathetic to the humanitarian conditions in Gaza due to a lot of media incitement, due to the media blackout that Tania spoke of. So there's definitely like, they're trying to both balance the kind of political media landscape and public opinion internally, which again is largely still hardened due to the horrific events of October 7th, while also being like, yeah, there are legal implications to blocking all of this aid. There are legal implications to us being implicated in famine. There are legal and humanitarian and political and just military, tactical implications for us not letting enough aid in. They also did say something which I know to be actually sadly true, and like I don't know what the path forward is. Part of a lot of these items, Tania, that you mentioned, they don't want to let them in. They don't want to let anything commercial. It's not just the dual use, it's anything commercial, because Hamas, which is a disgusting group, is imposing taxes. It's imposing about 3,000 shekels per truck of taxes on commercial goods coming in. And I know that to be true in terms of the humanitarian aid that Hamas steals and then repackages it and then sells it to private businesses and says, oh, well, here's a payment plan where you can pay taxes after the war. So like now, do I think that means we should not let any commercial aid in? Like, absolutely not. Like, and what's 3,000 shekels? Even the person that I was talking to was like, what's $900 going to Hamas for one truck? Like, I don't want any money to go to Hamas, but in the big picture, it's like, it's kind of like we acknowledge that some aid is going to be stolen. Nevertheless, we should still send aid in. It's like these calls, like I talk about aid theft, not to incite against aid, more aid going in, but to like say that in any conflict, unfortunately, you're going to have a lot of leakage from aid. So similarly, yeah. So that's that in terms of like why they're not letting in commercial aid, and in terms of like why they have to. I think I would attribute what the statements by Netanyahu that we're just letting in enough to that phenomenon of we can't be seen as doing good for Gaza because that's just not popular.
Thank you both for that. I want to just note here, J Street, and a few people have asked about this in the Q&A, so I do want to note J Street's position, which is that we support a negotiated stop to the fighting that would include the release of the remaining hostages held in Gaza. So that is J Street's position. It is one that we have throughout the past 4 months. We have constantly, revisited our positioning because it is very important to us that Israel have the ability to defend its citizens. But I did just want to share where, what the current state of our positioning is so that folks understand that. Now, I do want to turn back, and I say back because I did pose this to Senator Welch as well, to a very live question now, including within American politics, and that is the question of UNRWA. You guys are obviously completely aware of what happened a couple of weeks ago as the Israeli authorities went to UNRWA and identified and conveyed allegations that 12 UNRWA employees had taken part in the October 7th massacre. And of course, from that flowed very significant consequences as the Biden administration indicated that it would suspend humanitarian aid. A number of other countries have followed that. You heard Senator Welch talk about the current state of play in Congress, and the fact that U.S. aid would be, according to Congress, which of course has the ability and the responsibility to appropriate U.S. funds, would not be able to go to UNRWA. So my question for the two of you is, how central is UNRWA in terms of delivering aid within Gaza? Are there any other organizations, if UNRWA is defunded, are there other organizations that can pick up the slack? And I want to start with you on this, Ahmed, because having grown up in Gaza, I assume that you probably had quite a lot of contact with UNRWA. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I would be interested in just getting your sense of, what UNRWA's overall role is, how central, how important it is inside Gaza. So you first, Ahmed, please.
Certainly, and if I can ask Eliza, please, to drop in the chat a piece that I published in Newsweek last week about UNRWA and about my experiences growing up, going to UNRWA schools and having my family going there. That would be wonderful. But so I very much so have always recognized a variety of problems with UNRWA and a variety of the challenges, both immediate, short-term, long-term, tactical. Nevertheless, the problem with defunding UNRWA in the midst of the worst catastrophe that Gaza has seen in its history is that not only do you not have sufficient infrastructure for other organizations that can take this on. It's like I work in international development. That's my day job. We have so many agencies or organizations in Africa or Asia that we'll go to and we'll say, we give you, let's pretend, $1,000 a year. Can I just give you $10,000 and you just upgrade capacity and expand capacity? And a lot of organizations say, no, we can't take on additional funding. It's going to take us years to build up that capacity to be able to support more people and do life-saving work. Same thing with UNRWA. There's this fallacy that somehow this funding is fungible and somehow you're just going to be able to throw money at other organizations and they're going to be able to take on UNRWA's work. Furthermore, trying to do that in the midst of an active conflict with damaged infrastructure, with people, losing their lives, humanitarian workers and UNRWA workers and aid workers. I mean, my brother brought in, a team of British surgeons to do medical work, and they gave their coordinates to the IDF and COGAT. And what happened? The IDF shelled the position that they're in. And this is the doctor went on Christian Amanpour to talk about it. This is documented. This is not just me saying. So the unfortunate reality is that not only in Gaza, but we have to keep in mind in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, where you have millions of people who are living in second-class ghettos that are isolated and entirely prevented from integrating with particularly in Lebanon, integrating with the rest of the society. They're legally prevented from operating outside of these camps. So what happens now when Israel is surrounded all of a sudden by incredibly desperate Palestinian refugees in these centers, in these refugee centers that don't have medical supplies or education or something to keep out of trouble, which is why funding for UNRWA persisted for years. It wasn't just out of the goodness of the heart of the international community, but it was actually due to kind of strategists within Israel wanting this funding to sustain itself. So, and lastly, the United Nations is so stretched thin due to so many conflicts, not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere, that many of them don't have the capacity or the ability to simply expand capacity, even if you surge a lot of funding to them. HCR is not going to be able to surge capacity in a war zone overnight. So that's why UNRWA has to be sustained, has to be reformed. And there are many level heads working on UNRWA reforms. There are many people thinking about what can we do to separate Hamas from UNRWA. And that is unfortunately a reality, is at the rank and file level, Hamas has in fact penetrated UNRWA in a variety of ways, but also UNRWA over years and years of providing aid, they've had to work with Hamas. And I think instead of just like, okay, here's what we need to do to operate and survive in a place like Gaza, it became kind of like this casual working relationship that, you know, almost like UNRWA forgot that Hamas is this violent terror organization that is also holding its people hostage, and you should keep clear lines of separations. So it's a grim picture, but it's going to be a disaster of epic proportions if the funding is not restored anytime soon to UNRWA. And this article that I talked about I see Eliza, thank you, Eliza, and Newsweek, like I describe in detail how without UNRWA, the situation for millions of Palestinians would be exponentially worse. And finally, I'll conclude with this. Like, it's humiliating and degrading for many Palestinians to be aid dependent. Many people are not just like, you know, lazy freeloaders that are just sitting there in Gaza and saying, oh my God, I just love having to beg UNRWA for, you know, bags of flour. Like, of course, the goal is self-sufficiency. Of course, the goal is to, you know, in the long-term trajectory, to get people off aid and to create economic and sustainable development. And if you ask a lot of people in line at UNRWA distribution centers in Gaza right now, like they hate it. Like they're not sitting there and saying, oh my God, I'm so delighted to be standing in this awful, degrading line. It's like in the same way that many people here in the United States have done a lot of volunteer work for like food banks and food shelters, whatever. Like it's degrading. There's a lot of shame that goes in being, you know, hungry or having to seek aid. And the Palestinian people are no different.
I really appreciate that, Ahmed. I'm going to turn to you in just a second, Tania, but I do just want to note, in fact, Tania, you and I have talked on other occasions about the fact that, you know, long before October 7th, of course, there was a very long-running blockade in effect levied by Israel, which of course magnified the need for humanitarian aid even long before October 7th. And of course, UNRWA played a major role in that. And so, Tania, I wonder if you might offer your thoughts on this question about UNRWA specifically and the capacity potentially for other organizations to pick up the slack.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I definitely echo what was said. There really is no replacement for UNRWA. They have massive infrastructure. Just to put this into numbers, I mean, they're saying there's around 3,000 employees who are still working. They're available to work. If you imagine, let's say the WFP wants to take over overnight. Again, yeah, how in the middle of a war, in the middle of a catastrophe, we're talking about famine conditions, perhaps. How are you going to interview 3,000 people to take over those positions? It really doesn't make any sense. And I want to just take a bit of a bird's eye view. You know, I've been saying this isn't about the allegations, as serious as they are, and they should be investigated. This is a long-running attack that's been on UNRWA, specifically on the UN in general, but UNRWA specifically because its role in providing services to refugees. I want to share that, you know, in the weeks and months leading up to this, there was discussion inside of Israel all the time about how to get rid of UNRWA, as if you get rid of UNRWA, you get rid of the refugee problem or situation. A real kind of wishful thinking on the part of you know, many people inside of Israel, and identifying UNRWA as the problem. And I'll also say, you know, UNRWA, because of its massive role right now inside of Gaza, providing humanitarian assistance, over 1 million people in its shelters, they are one of the most vocal agencies talking about what's happening on the ground. And so by, you know, putting out these allegations on the very same day, I want to add that the ICJ issued its provisional measures, you know, you're essentially delegitimizing one of the main voices of criticism about the situation on the ground. And so I really think it's incumbent upon us, on the one hand, to take the allegations very seriously, but also remember we're in an active, very violent situation of hostilities. And one of the parties to the hostilities has, you know, put out this information and these allegations. And so we have to take those, the timing of it, the context, with many, many grains of salt. And yeah, that this is definitely not the right time in the middle of a catastrophe to take this kind of decision. And again, the fact that we're talking about perhaps famine-like conditions, maybe even worse, it really is, you know, I can't even put into words, you know, ridiculous doesn't begin to cover it. It's a kind of cruelty that we really can't be a part of right now. And I will also say, you know, I have a lot of criticism of the US government and other governments who really hastily rushed to not even necessarily cut funding, but certainly to make these statements about it. We know that many countries, they weren't due to make actual payments anytime soon. And so this was a sort of political move, and that the countries, as far as we know, haven't even received detailed information about the allegations, and certainly not of the evidence, before making these really rash decisions. So again, I think that there's a lot to look at here, and we really need to be more kind of critically minded when we're looking at information that's coming out from either party in these hostilities right now.
Thank you. So I want to, as we are approaching the end of our time together, I want to have you folks address a few of the really key questions that I see from our audience in the chat, and I'll pose a few questions. We'll give each of you an opportunity, Ahmed and Tania, to respond, and that'll be the end of our time. I do just want to note that there was a question in the Q&A about the availability of this video, and I want to ask again if my colleague Eliza would just drop the link into the chat where the video will be available later this afternoon. And then Tania and Ahmed, here are my questions for you. Ahmed, let's turn to you with this one. How can Palestinians have a legitimate democratic government after the war? What do you see as the path forward? I know this is something that you wrote about in the piece that you just published today in The Atlantic, which we shared. So if you could address that, both of you could address, you're both Americans, the question of what you think the US can do and what you would like to see the US government do. And then we've just received a lot of questions and comments from folks in the Q&A who are really desperate to help. And if you could offer any thoughts about how those watching our webinar today can help, that would be great. Why don't we turn to you, Ahmed, first?
Thank you. I mean, yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? And I think first and foremost, a lot of Palestinians can't begin to think about democratic governance and reform in the midst of an active conflict in the midst of escalating settler violence. And the settler violence in the West Bank, which is a long-running problem that has escalated to epic proportions, coupled with continued delegitimization of the Palestinian Authority, which for all of its faults and all of its corruption, and I used to be one of the most fierce critics of the Palestinian Authority, has absolutely prevented the West Bank from collapsing and falling into a third intifada. So that's number one. Is I think there needs to be a cessation of the violence, of the hostilities, just for people to catch a breath, to literally begin to think forward. Number two is I very much so am a believer, as much as I hope the blurring of my face goes away from Zoom, but I'm a believer that as much as I despise Hamas politically, there has to be a way, and there are examples in recent history where violent groups were politically and administratively rehabilitated, such that there may be an off-ramp, a political off-ramp for Hamas if they agree to renounce violence, if they agree to engage in political discourse, to sorry, my Zoom thing. If they agree to engage in a political process, you look at the FARC rebels in Colombia, you look at the IRA in Northern Ireland, you look at even the PLO after they left Lebanon in '82 and agreed to evacuate. So the path for democratic governance has to include all Palestinians, but I think learning from the mistake of 2006, and also looking at what happened in the Arab Spring and how it was sabotaged by a lot of Islamist groups that used the democratic process to implement inherently undemocratic rules and governments and regimes and political programs. So I think there needs to be a political pathway for all Palestinians to seek democratic representation in a parliament, to have presidential elections, to have local elections, just like in the US context. I mean, Hamas mainly won a lot of these, Hamas won a lot of local councils, and that's where their electoral victory came from. However, there has to be parameters for who gets to participate in it. You can't despise the Oslo process and the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, and then for recognizing Israel and for creating a political framework, and then actually go into this political framework using a violent armed resistance project. So I very much so think, I'll leave with this because I do try to be helpful. Even within Gaza, even though, for all these polls we're seeing, blah, 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 and I've written extensively about how I think these polls are entirely unrepresentative of the true sentiments in Gaza. Out of the ashes and I'm speaking specifically about Gaza, of what's happening and out of the damage and destruction, I can assure you that there's absolutely a desire, an unprecedented desire for a different path forward, one that does not include armed resistance, one in which people want to see Gaza becoming a beacon for Palestinian art and culture and kind of a role model for a future Palestinian state. And so I absolutely believe that once this conflict stops and once we figure out a negotiated settlement that doesn't allow Hamas to keep its current form of rule in place, there absolutely is a path forward for a rejuvenated Palestinian national project that can engage with a two-state solution.
All right. Well, to that I say, inshallah and be'ezrat Hashem. Tania, we are going to turn to you for your last comments.
Sure. So yeah, there's a lot that the U.S. can do. I will say that I acknowledge that the U.S. is taking the lead role on the issue of humanitarian access, and what little progress we've seen has been as a result of U.S. action. So I'd like to see them doing more, doing more on what some of these recommendations I made about allowing access through Israeli ports, allowing sourcing in Israel and the West Bank, allowing the private sector to operate again, restoring electricity and water. I think that the U.S. can be stronger in demanding that these things happen, reversing the decision on UNRWA and making a clear statement about the need for their continued operations. increasing, aid coming in. And I will say the issue of ceasefire, I really see it as the only way for the hostages to be released. And that really needs to happen right now. Just last night, of course, we heard about more people who have died either at some point in their, in the time that they've been in Gaza. We want those people out now. And I also just, think that there is no way to bomb away an ideology. True security for Israel is not going to come through more bombardments of the Strip, more siege. We really are also paying a price. I mean, people on the ground, of course, paying the highest price in the incredible suffering. But I think as humanity standing by, we're also paying a price for what's happening and allowing it to continue. So what people can do, of course, hassle your representatives. J Street does this best, and they know how to find your representatives. So please reach out to people and just keep talking about the situation, keeping this issue on the agenda from whatever perspective you're coming from is so important to keep the parties, moving towards some kind of progress. And certainly if you can open your pockets and give to one of the many organizations that are working on the ground, to J Street, to Gisha, I mean, any of the many actors who are really working hard to improve this situation, it is also critical.
Deborah, literally 15 seconds, just 15 seconds. Tania, I want to give like a special thanks and acknowledgement to Tania, somewhat like not just for the amazing work they do, they being Gisha, sorry, but like for years, I've talked to so many Gazans, particularly when I was doing the Gaza airport work, full time. And so many spoke incredibly of the incredible relationships that they have with Gisha and how much good this organization, this Israeli organization, has done to better the lives of so many Gazans. So I really, a heartfelt thank you to you, Tania and Gisha. I know it's difficult. I know you guys get attacked. I know it's harsh. You're operating in a really impossible situation and environment. So like a heartfelt thank you to you. And then finally, I very much so think the World Food Program, for the time being, at scale, there's a special Gaza Appeal USA, World Food Program USA, where donations are tax deductible. I think that's a great place to give because they absolutely are getting the largest amount of food into Gaza at like an industrial scale. I also think Palestine Children's Relief Fund, there's UNRWA, definitely Gisha and J Street. But yeah, thank you, Tania, and please give my love to the good people at Gisha.
Well, that was
Thank
the
you.
best possible ending I could think of for this webinar. That was really lovely. We are so grateful to both of you, Tania Hary from Gisha, Ahmed Alkhatib, for joining us and sharing your insights today. And of course, as I know you will, keep up your important work. Thanks to everybody for joining us today, and take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.